In the summer of 1979, in a small agricultural county in the eastern Nebraska sandhills, a 44-year-old woman named Adeline Marsh paid $1,100 for a failing beekeeping operation that every serious farmer in Holt County had already written off as a lost cause. The previous owner, a retired schoolteacher named George Pell, had worked 42 hives for 9 years and had spent the last 3 of those years watching his colonies collapse one by one in ways he could not explain and could not stop. His daughter in Omaha wanted the land cleared. She had been asking him to sell since her mother died. By the time Adeline drove out to the Pell place on a Thursday afternoon in July, there were 23 hives left, most of them weakened, and George was ready to be done with all of it. He met her at the gate in rubber boots and a sun hat, the kind of man who apologized before you asked him anything. "The bees are worse than they look," he told her, which was not an encouraging beginning to a sale. She told him she had seen worse. He did not believe her, but he showed her the hives anyway, walking her down the long row of white boxes in the afternoon heat, while she opened each one and moved through the frames without gloves, without any of the hesitation that most visitors showed around 40,000 bees in a bad mood. She spent 2 hours with those hives. George sat on a lawn chair under a cottonwood tree and watched. A man from the county extension office had come out in May and told him the colonies were probably suffering from a combination of mite load and poor forage. The extension man had recommended a treatment protocol and then driven back to O'Neill. George had followed the protocol. The bees had continued to die. Adeline came back to the cottonwood tree and stood in front of George for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Your forage is wrong." George looked at her. He had 200 acres of cropland in soybeans and corn. He had a county road on one side and a dry creek bed on the other. There were pastures beyond the creek that had not been hayed in several years and were growing up in what most people in Holt County would have called weeds. "I know it," George said. "That's the Reinhardt ground. They've let it go." Adeline looked at the pasture across the creek for a long time. Then she named a price for the hives. George said yes before she finished the sentence. They shook hands in the shade of the cottonwood. Adeline drove home. Her farmhand, a quiet man of 58 named Dolph Cranmer, helped her load the hives on a flatbed the following Tuesday and haul them to her place on the west side of the county, where she ran 160 acres of mixed ground, some of it cropped, most of it in permanent pasture that she had not changed in the 7 years since her husband Ray had died and left her the operation. Dolph had worked for Ray for 11 years and had stayed on without being asked. He was not a man who needed things explained to him, but he asked about the bees on the drive home because the bees were the sort of thing that required asking. "You're keeping them," he said. "I'm keeping them." Dolph drove for a while. He had never worked around bees and was not certain he wanted to start. He had opinions about what belonged on a farm and what did not, and bees occupied an uncertain position in his accounting. They were not livestock, exactly, but they were not crops either. They were something else, something you had to understand from a different direction. "What are you going to do with them?" he finally asked. Same thing George was trying to do. Make honey. George wasn't making much honey, Dolph said, which was true, and they both knew it. George didn't have the right land, Adeline said. Dolph looked out the window at the sandhills going past. The sandhills in July were the color of old straw, bleached and dry and rolling in long waves toward the horizon. He had grown up on sandhills ground, and he knew what it was and what it wasn't. And what it mostly wasn't was good country for honey production. Too dry, Too sandy, not enough of the right flowers. He did not say any of this because Adeline Marsh was not a woman you argued with about land. She had grown up on sandhills ground, same as he had. And she had gone to Lincoln for 2 years at the agricultural college and come back knowing things about soil and grass and forage systems that the county extension office was still catching up to. She had opinions about her ground that were not conventional opinions, and in Dolph's experience, her unconventional opinions had a way of being correct at intervals that made him careful about the ones he had not yet seen proven. He set the hives in a long row at the north edge of her pasture, behind a windbreak of cedar and hackberry, where they would have morning sun and afternoon shade. It was good placement. Even Dolph could see that. Within a week, Holt County had a new piece of conversation. Adeline Marsh had bought George Pell's bees, bought them for $1,100, which was not much money, and also more than most people thought George's failing hives were worth. She was going to run them on her place, which was sandhills ground, which was not bee country, which was the kind of decision that gave people in the county cafe in O'Neill something to talk about on a slow Tuesday morning. Adeline was known in Holt County. She was known the way a woman running a farm alone is always known in a county of 2,000 people, which is to say, she was discussed more than she was talked to. She had taken over the Marsh place when Ray died in 1972, and had not sold it, and had not failed, which was the kind of thing people noted without saying directly. She was polite and reserved, and did not explain herself to anyone who had not asked a good question. And most of the people in O'Neill could not decide, admire her, or to find her puzzling. They usually landed on puzzling. Let me tell you about Adeline Marsh, because what she did with those 23 failing hives over the next 12 years only makes sense if you understand where she came from and what she had learned. She was born in 1935 on a mixed grass Sandhills Ranch 10 miles north of Bassett, the second of 4 children of a woman named Helen and a man named Warren Colton, who ran cattle and a small hay operation, and who had the kind of relationship with the land that people in his generation called common sense, and people in later generations would call ecological literacy, which is the same thing with a longer name. Warren Colton was not a man who read agricultural journals. He was a man who walked his pastures every morning for 40 years and wrote down what he saw, not in a formal log, but in a series of green composition notebooks that he kept on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. "The grass is thinning on the south hill," he would write. "The milkweed is coming back in the east draw. The ironweed is taking the lower pasture again this year." He did not do anything immediately with these observations. He simply made them year after year, building a record of the land that was more detailed than any county survey and more honest than any crop report. Adeline had helped her father with those notebooks from the time she was 9 years old. She would hold the flashlight while he wrote in the early mornings before the fieldwork started. She had learned to read the land by watching him read it, which meant she had learned to see things that most people drove past without noticing. The milkweed in the east draw was not a weed to Warren Colton. It was a signal, a piece of information about soil, moisture, and disturbance history and pollinator habitat. He did not use those words. He just knew that where the milkweed came back strong, the ground had been left alone long enough to remember what it wanted to be. She went to Lincoln in 1953 and came home in 1955 when her mother had a difficult winter with her health. She had met Ray Marsh in Lincoln and married him the following spring, but it was a drive and they had moved to his family's ground in Holt County, where Ray's father was getting too old to run the operation alone. Ray was a good man and a careful farmer, not as imaginative as Adeline but steady, which is a quality that covers a great deal of ground in a long marriage. He died of a heart attack at 51, in the middle of a March that was too cold and a spring that came too late, and Adeline was left at 37 with 160 acres, a small cattle operation, a house that needed a new roof, and a farmhand named Dolph Cranmer, who showed up on Monday morning and did not ask whether he was still employed. She ran the cattle operation for 7 years the way Ray had taught her, which was the way his father had taught him, which was conservative and careful and not particularly imaginative. Her yields were modest. Her losses were low. She made her operating payments and kept the place in good repair and did not borrow money she did not need to borrow. And she thought about her father's green composition notebooks more often than she thought about anything else. The problem with her ground was forage, specifically the forage she was not using. The sandhills of eastern Nebraska are not one kind of plant. Anyone driving through them on a state highway sees grass, an ocean of grass rolling to every horizon, and thinks, grass. But the sandhills are not grass. They are dozens of species, a community of plants that evolved together over 10,000 years on soils that are unlike any other soils in North America. Ancient sand dunes stabilized by root systems so deep and so intricate that they hold the hills in place against winds that would otherwise move them. In that community are the grasses that cattle eat eagerly, and in that same community are the forbs and the flowering plants and the deep-rooted perennials that cattle walk past without a second look. Adeline had been watching those plants her whole life. The goldenrod coming up in the wet draws, the wild bergamot on the dry ridges, the purple prairie clover, and the pale purple coneflower and the lead plant growing in thick stands wherever the cattle pressure had eased, the rosenweed, the rattlesnake master, the native sunflowers that bloomed in August when everything else was going to seed. All of them producing pollen and nectar from May through October in a sequence so carefully timed that the whole system looked designed, which in a biological sense it was. Cattle ignored every one of those plants. Adeline had read, not the extension bulletins, which said what the county already knew. She had been reading university research from Minnesota and Wisconsin and Kansas. Papers from researchers who had been documenting what beekeepers in the Midwest had always suspected but rarely stated formally. The best honey country in North America was not orchard country or clover country or alfalfa country, though those produced well. The best honey country was native prairie, specifically the remnant native prairie that still existed in the sandhills and the flint hills and the tall grass margins of the Dakotas, places where the full sequence of bloom had not been broken by monoculture, where the bees could move from flower to flower from April through frost without running out of forage. She had been thinking about bees since 1975. When a university extension bulletin had crossed her desk that documented the collapse of managed honeybee colonies across the Central Plains and traced a significant portion of that collapse to forage gaps. Periods of 2 to 4 weeks in the summer, when there was simply nothing blooming within flight range of the hives, periods when colonies that had been healthy in June ate through their honey reserves in August and went into fall too weak to survive winter. The bulletin had included a map of forage bloom sequences across Nebraska. The sandhills ground, particularly the ungrazed or lightly grazed sandhills ground, had shown the longest unbroken bloom sequence of any region in the state. She had been planning for 4 years before George Pell's daughter called from Omaha. That is why the county could not make sense of the purchase. They were watching a woman rescue a failing bee operation on land that was not supposed to support bees. They were actually watching a woman execute a plan she had been developing since 1975, and George Pell's failing hives had not created the opportunity. The opportunity had been waiting for the right hives to fail their way into her hands. The first 2 years were the years of observation. Dolph moved the hives twice in the first summer, following Adeline's instructions, placing them progressively further into the native pasture ground where the bloom sequence was densest. She had divided her 160 acres into sections based on what was flowering when, and she moved the hives through those sections on a schedule that no commercial beekeeper in Holt County would have recognized, because no commercial beekeeper in Holt County was working with native prairie on this kind of ground. At the end of the first summer, 12 of the 23 colonies had recovered to full strength. 6 were marginal. 5 she combined and requeened, reducing the surviving colonies to 15, but making them viable. The honey yield from those 15 colonies in 1979 was 240 pounds. Not impressive numbers, not the kind of numbers that changed anything. But the honey was different. Anyone who tasted it said so without being asked. It was darker than clover honey, more complex, with a flavor that people tried to describe and usually gave up on because there were not good words for it in the vocabulary of people who had only ever tasted commercial honey. It tasted like the sandhills smelled in August, which was a description that meant nothing to anyone who had not stood in a native prairie draw in August and breathed it in, and meant everything to anyone who had. She sold it at 40 cents a pound to the general store in O'Neill, which took it tentatively and sold out in 3 weeks. Dolph tasted it once and did not say anything about it for several days. Then he said, "That is not the same as regular honey." Adeline said, "No, it is not." He nodded and went back to what he was doing, which, with Dolph, was his way of endorsing something he did not have better words for. In 1980, she requeened all 15 colonies, with queens bred from her strongest local survivors, which was a decision that would take 3 years to show its full effect, but which she understood was the right decision. The same way her father had understood that the milkweed in the East Draw was information and not an inconvenience. In 1981, she added 12 new packages from a supplier in South Dakota and began splitting her strongest colonies in May rather than letting them swarm, which doubled her colony count by August and gave her twice the foraging capacity on the same ground. By the end of that summer, she had 31 colonies producing on the native pasture, and her honey yield was 920 pounds. She sold that honey at 50 cents a pound. She sold it in 2 weeks. People drove from Atkinson and Ainsworth to buy it, which was the kind of thing that did not go unremarked in a county where people tracked which farmwife's preserves had sold out at the county fair. The word got around, not the way the original story had gotten around, as a curiosity. This was different. This was the kind of word that traveled in the back of a pickup truck between 2 men who did not talk much, but who both knew what good honey tasted like and were comparing notes on where to get more of it. Adeline did not advertise. She did not put a sign at the end of her drive. She sold what she had when people came to buy it, and she put the money back into the bees, into more hives and better queens, and one piece of equipment at a time from a beekeeper's supply catalog she kept on the kitchen table. By 1984, she was running 64 colonies. Her honey yield that year was just over 4,000 pounds. She sold it all before Christmas at 65 cents a pound. Net from the honey operation that year, after equipment and queens and the small amount of labor beyond what Dolph was already doing, was just over $1,800. Not life-changing money on a farm that needed to pay its own way, but money from an enterprise that had cost her $1,100 to begin, and had ridden free on land that had always produced this forage, and had never had anything to eat it. And here was the part that mattered beyond the money. Here was the part Adeline had been watching for since she moved those first hives into the native pasture in the summer of 1979. The pasture was changing, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious to someone driving past on the county road, but Adeline, who had been walking that ground since 1965, and who had her father's eyes for what a pasture was telling you, could see it. The plant diversity in the sections where the hives had been heaviest was measurably greater than in the sections she had managed differently. Species she had not seen on her ground in 10 years were coming back, not because she had planted them, but because something had changed in the pollination pressure on the ground, because 64 colonies of bees working those flowers through the full bloom season were provided that the native plants had evolved require, and had been going without. The lead plant was spreading into areas where it had not been established for 20 years. The cantas. The purple prairie clover was thickening in the draws. The wild bergamot was moving up the dry ridges and filling in gaps between the grasses where bare sandy soil had been showing through. The cattle liked what was happening, though they did not know why. The grass was thicker in those sections, denser at the root, more resilient when she pushed the stocking rate in late summer. The organic matter in the soil in those sections had increased in ways she could see with her eyes before she measured it with a test, because darker soil holds moisture differently and moves differently under your boots, and Adeline Marsh knew the difference between soil that was building and soil that was spending down its inheritance. She called it a reciprocal system, though she did not use that term publicly, because nobody had asked her for a term, and she was not the kind of person who offered vocabulary no one had requested. The bees needed the native plants. The native plants needed the bees. The cattle benefited from both. The three enterprises on her ground were not competing for the same resources. They were each using resources the others could not access, and the whole was producing more than the sum of the parts, which is the kind of statement that sounds abstract until you are standing on a sandhills pasture in June watching it happen under your feet. In 1985, 2 beekeepers in the county, a younger man named Phil Hawk and a woman from outside chambers named Roberta Teal, came to see what Adeline was doing. She walked them through the pasture. She showed them the hive placement and the bloom sequence map she had been building since 1979. She did not lecture. She let them walk the ground and look at the colonies and taste the honey from the extractor in the old barn her father-in-law had built in 1948. Phil started 3 colonies on his property the following spring. Roberta started 8. Their neighbors made the same jokes that had been made about Adeline in 1979. By 1987, Phil's 3 colonies had become 20, and Roberta's 8 had become 30, and neither of them had told anyone in the county how well the operation was going, because they had both learned, without anyone saying it directly, that you did not talk about a good year in farming before it had finished being good. Let me tell you about the summer of 1988, because this is where 12 years of quiet, patient work met the hardest test anyone in the Central Plains had seen in a generation, and most people failed it. The drought of 1988 did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like a slow withdrawal, the way a tide goes out so gradually that you do not notice until the boats are sitting on the mud. The winter of 1987 had been dry. The spring of 1988 had been dry in a different way. One of those springs where it rained enough to make you believe it was going to be fine, and then stopped raining in May and did not start again. By June, the corn in Holt County was showing stress. By July, it was showing damage. The creeks ran low or dry. The hay crop came in light. The pastures in the county were already grazed down to the crowns by the third week of July, on land where the crowns should not have been visible until September. Beekeepers across Nebraska had a catastrophic summer. The drought broke the forage sequence that bees depended on. The clovers failed in June. The alfalfa came in sparse and went to seed too quickly. The flowering plants in the roadsides and the field margins that commercial beekeepers depended on for their summer flow simply did not bloom, or bloomed thin and early and then stopped. Colonies that had been building well in spring went queenless or starved in July and August. Drought hot. Tens of thousands of colonies across the state losing population so fast that beekeepers who had been in the business for 20 years were watching it happen and did not know what to do to stop it. Colonies lost in a bad summer are not a one-year problem. A colony that starves in August cannot be rebuilt before winter. It either dies going into winter or comes out of winter too weak to build in spring. A beekeeper who loses half his colonies in a drought summer does not recover in 1 year. He recovers in 3 if he is lucky and careful, and if the next 2 summers are good. Adeline did not lose a colony in the summer of 1988. Her native prairie had done in the drought exactly what her father's green composition notebooks had implied native plants do in hard years. They went dormant early and came back later than the commercial crops, and they came back in an order that provided the bees with forage when the commercial forage was gone. Because native plants in the sandhills did not require the same soil moisture that alfalfa and clover required, and because their root systems went down 6 and 8 and 10 feet into sand that held old water from wet, years long after the surface had gone to dust. The goldenrod bloomed in August 1988 when the temperature was 94 degrees, and the corn in the county was burning in the field. The native sunflowers bloomed in late August on ground where the cattle grass had stopped growing in July. The ironweed in the low draws bloomed in September when the farmers around O'Neill were already feeding hay they had budgeted for December. Adeline's 68 colonies worked all of it, packing frames with the dark of stressed native plants in a year when the commercial beekeepers in the county were opening their hives and finding frames that were nearly empty. Dolph Cranmer was 67 years old that summer. He had been on the Marsh place since Ray was alive, had watched the bees come in 1979 with the same skepticism he had brought to everything unfamiliar, and had become, somewhere around 1983, a better beekeeper than most of the people in Holt County who had been keeping bees their whole lives. He would not have said that, because Dolph did not say things like that about himself. But the bees knew it, which was the part that counted. In September of 1988, Dolph and Adeline were pulling honey frames from the hives in the north section of the pasture, working in the long, late afternoon light that comes to the sandhills in fall, gold and slow and generous in the way of light that has been through a hard summer and come out the other side. The colonies were heavy. The frames were capped. The extractor in the old barn was running continuously for the fourth day in a row. Dolph pulled a frame and held it up against the light. The comb was full, each cell sealed with wax the color of cream, the honey dark beneath it. The kind of frame that in a good year was ordinary, and in a year like this one was extraordinary. He put it in the box without saying anything. Then he said, "Phil Houck lost 20 colonies." Adeline did not look up from the hive she was working. She had heard. Roberta Teal lost 30. Adeline set the frame she was holding into the box and straightened up. She looked out across the pasture. The goldenrod in the east section was still blooming, yellow and dense against the pale August grass. And the bees were working it in the mid-afternoon heat, with the focused industry of creatures that had not been told the year was supposed to be a disaster. She did not say anything immediately. There was not much to say that the goldenrod was not already saying. Dolph picked up the next frame. He looked at it a long time before he put it in the box. Then he said, "I should have asked fewer questions in 1979. Adeline said, "You asked the right questions." He had. He had asked what she was going to do with them, and she had told him, and he had watched it happen. And the watching had been its own education. They worked in silence for a while. The extractor ran in the barn. The bees moved across the goldenrod. The sandhills turned gold and then orange in the fall light, the way they do when a summer is finishing and a fall is beginning and the land is settling into itself after whatever the year has cost it. The O'Neill Frontier ran a small story in October about local beekeepers who had survived the summer. Adeline was the only producer in the county who had not only survived but had finished the year with more colonies than she had started with, because 3 of her strongest colonies had split in late summer, and she had caught the swarms and installed them in empty equipment rather than let them go. She had ended 1988 with 71 colonies, 3 more than she had begun with, and her honey yield for the year was the highest she had recorded, 4,840 pounds of native sandhills prairie honey that she sold in 2 months to buyers from O'Neill and Atkinson and Ainsworth, and a small restaurant in Norfolk that had heard about her honey through a customer who had brought a jar back from a visit to relatives in the county. The reporter who wrote the story asked her how she had managed it. Adeline said she had been putting her hives in the right place for long enough that the right place had grown around them. The reporter wrote that down and used it in the story, and then added a sentence explaining what she meant, because he was not sure the readers would understand it without explanation. He was right that they would not. He was wrong that his explanation helped. Some things do not compress. Phil Houck rebuilt his colonies over 3 years. Roberta Teal rebuilt hers in 2, partly because she had kept 12 colonies in a section of native pasture that she had half forgotten about and half neglected, and those 12 came through the summer thin but alive, and they were the foundation she rebuilt from. She called Adeline in November of 1988 and asked if she could come out and walk the pasture again, more carefully this time, with a notebook. Adeline said yes. Roberta spent a day on the Marsh place in April of 1989 with a yellow legal pad, writing down everything Adeline showed her. She did not ask how long it had taken to build what she was looking at. She could see from the plant community alone that it had taken longer than she had been patient enough to wait in 1985. Adeline ran the bee operation and the cattle together on that ground until 1997, the year she turned 62, and her knees told her that the hive work in midsummer was a younger person's argument to make. She sold the cattle first, then looked for someone to take the hives. Her niece, the daughter of her older brother Clark, had been spending summers on the place since she was in high school, and had the same habit of walking the pasture without being told to that Adeline recognized from her own childhood on her father's ground. The niece's name was Lydia Colton. She took the hives and the bloom sequence maps and the 12 years of hive records Adeline had kept in the same green composition notebooks her father had used for the grass. Lydia runs the operation today. The colony count is just over 90 hives. The native pasture that the bees have been working for more than 40 years is the most plant-diverse ground in Holt County by any measure that exists for measuring such things, a fact that a graduate student from the University of Nebraska documented in a 2011 field survey, without knowing the history of how it had come to be that way. The O'Neill Chamber of Commerce gave Adeline a small recognition in 2009, the year she turned 74, at a luncheon for local agricultural innovators. She almost did not go. Lydia drove her. Adeline stood at the front of the room with a single card she had written on that morning and looked out at the people who had driven in from the county. Some of them farmers she had known for 40 years, some of them younger people who had heard the name without knowing the story. She said, "People have asked me for a long time why I bought a failing bee operation in Sandhills country that was not supposed to support bees. That is not the interesting question. The interesting question is why the country was not supposed to support them." She paused. The native plants on Sandhills ground have been producing nectar and pollen since before there were European settlers in Nebraska. The bees that worked those plants were native bees. Solitary bees, bumblebees, a system that had been running without interruption for longer than anyone in this room can think about. The European honeybee is a recent arrival and an excellent one, because it does exactly what the native bees were doing, and it does it at scale, and it produces something you can harvest. What we did, over about 50 years of turning native prairie into cropland, was break the sequence. We took out the native plants and put in crops that bloom once and stop. We gave the bees a good April and a bad July and told them to manage. Most of them could not. She put the card in her jacket pocket. She said, "In 1979, I paid $1,100 for 23 hives that were failing. In 1988, every commercial beekeeper in my county had a catastrophic summer, and I harvested the most honey I had ever put up. The difference was not skill, and it was not luck, and it was not anything I invented. The difference was that I put my bees on ground that was already doing what bees need done, and I gave it enough years to show me what it could do." She paused a last time. "I learned to read land from my father. He learned to read it from his is like that. It does not transfer quickly, and it does not transfer easily, and it does not transfer easily, and it cannot be downloaded from a county extension bulletin. You get it from walking the same ground for 30 years and writing down what you see, which is the least dramatic thing in the world to describe, and the most important thing I know how to do." Phil Hawk was in the room. He was 64 years old, and his 4 years operation had grown to 40 colonies on a mix of native and cultivated ground, and he had not lost a colony to a drought summer since 1988, which was the year he had understood, in the specific and unignorable way that financial loss teaches, what Adeline had been trying to show him since 1985. After the luncheon, he found her by the door. $1,100, he said. She smiled. For 23 dying hives. It was 23 hives nobody wanted, she said. Plus, George Pell got to stop worrying about them, which was worth something to a man who was 71 years old and tired. Phil nodded. He looked down at the floor the way a man looks at something he should have understood a long time ago. "What did you see?" he asked, "when you walked into that pasture across from George's hives and looked at all those weeds nobody had touched in 5 years?" Adeline looked at him for a moment. She said, "I saw 5 years of uninterrupted bloom sequence. I saw ironweed and goldenrod, and native sunflower, and rattlesnake, master, and wild bergamot, and every one of them going to full flower and full seed without a mower or a herbicide or a grazing animal touching them. I saw everything a healthy colony needs to survive a hard summer, growing 30 feet from hives that were starving for lack of it." She picked up her jacket. Everyone else saw an abandoned pasture going to weeds. That is the only difference. Not intelligence. Not courage. Not any particular gift. Just the ability to look at something the county had given up on and see what it was actually doing, which requires nothing more and nothing less than having walked enough ground to know what good looks like, when it is not asking for your permission to be good. The sandhills outside O'Neill are still rolling the way they have always rolled, in long grassy waves that look simple from a car window, and are not simple if you stop and walk into them, which most people do not do, and Adeline Marsh did every morning, for 32 years, beginning before sunrise and ending when the light was good enough to write by, filling notebooks with what she found, building, one season at a time, the thing her father had built before her, a record of the land so detailed and so honest that when the hard year came, she already knew what it would do.